So we'd like to ask that everybody introduce themselves through the chat function, because we're going to keep folks on mute for the beginning of this at least. Tonight's topic is going to be offshore wind, both in the Northeast, Massachusetts, and then we'll look a little bit more locally at some of the opportunities. We're asking that everybody stay muted during the presentation, ask questions in the chat, or let us know if you have a question, and then we can call on you if we need to do it that way. This presentation will be recorded to make available for future use. So we're going to go ahead and start that. If you don't want to be on a recording, then now would be the time to go off the call and watch it later. All right, so Dave, if you can go ahead and start the recording.
Done.
Okay. So this will be the beginning officially of our SAFE 2021 February 4th meeting on offshore wind. And we'd like to welcome everybody. We've got over 77 participants here on the call, so clearly there's a lot of interest, which is wonderful. And I just want to set the stage, and then we'll do a few other welcomes and thank yous. Just to set the stage, I want everybody to know that, you know, we're really trying to look at this in an exploratory mode. So, you know, we're really looking at exploratory in general when we're talking about any developments on the North Shore. So I don't want folks to think that we've gotten too far ahead and that we're just, you know, jumping right into something or that something is imminently pending. That's not the case. We're trying to learn more about what the opportunities are. And while we want to allow people to express their legitimate concerns and address those things and make sure that those things are addressed, we do request that people limit the length of their comments and the topic to constructive criticisms. So we reserve the right to curtail anyone who does not abide by this request, but we'll try to keep it moving positively, and we look forward to the conversations near the end if we can continue to do that. So without further ado, Pat, do you want to go ahead and welcome some of our officials?
Yeah, thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to see this turnout. We knew that there was a lot of interest in offshore wind based on previous events that SAFE has sponsored and that SAFE members have flocked to when Amber Hewitt has presented. So we were really thrilled that Amber and her new partner in the offshore wind effort, Jen Benson of the Alliance for Business Leadership, is joining her in the presentation tonight. I want to welcome, as far as I've been scrolling through names in the chat, and I want to welcome especially and thank our elected legislators from the Salem area. Our representative, Paul Tucker. Thank you, Paul. You've been a great environmental asset, and you've been so supportive of all of the environmental asks that we've made of you. And we are really appreciative that you're taking on offshore wind as well as I think a couple of our favorites that we were pushing you about before were carbon pricing and environmental justice, and you hopped right on easily. The other person we want to thank is Senator Joan Lovely, who also was a great ally in terms of carbon pricing and environmental justice. And we're really thrilled that Senator Lovely is going to be following offshore wind. Back in the summer of 2018, I believe, Cindy Keegan and SAFE Vice Chair Stan Franzine and I met with Senator Lovely, and we brought as a special guest to talk about offshore wind, Amber Hewitt. And it was clear that Amber Hewitt really laid out a very important case for offshore wind to Senator Lovely. And I think it was really the first time she began thinking about it in terms of what we could do on the North Shore. So thank you to the elected officials. We also have City Councilors Steve Dibble, who's on the call, Conrad Prasniewski, who is also on the call, Domingo Dominguez, and Patty Mercillo. And we thank you all for spending your time with us to hear about this exciting new prospect for the Atlantic seaboard that also may include Salem. So thank you. And Cindy, turn it over to you, my fearless co-chair.
All righty, so I've got the agenda up. We'll be talking for a little while on offshore wind specifically, looking at a couple of different aspects, and then we'll go into a question and answer mode at the end, and then we'll have a small portion just to have people be able to announce for upcoming meetings or announcements they'd like to share. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers this evening. So former State Rep Jen Benson and Amber Hewitt, who both are now partnering on this Mass Offshore Wind Committee, but certainly have lots of other wonderful credentials that are up there as well. So we welcome them, and then I will stop sharing so that they can converse with us. All right. I think Dave, you need to ask them to unmute, or I can. Hold on.
Oh, thank you.
There we go.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. And I have to give a quick shout out to my former colleagues, Paul Tucker, who has been just a stalwart supporter and worker and a warrior for the environment. Anything I ever asked him to do, he did and improved upon anything I thought of. So thank you, Paul. And Senator Lovely, it's lovely to see you. And I haven't seen you in quite some time, but I'm really excited to see you here and to visit with you in your home city. And to all the city councilors who are here, thank you for coming. And it's wonderful to see such interest and a great attitude from your elected officials. You're really lucky to be there in Salem. So I'm going to give kind of a little opening overview, and then I'm going to let Amber do the heavy lifting because she's a lot smarter than I am on these issues. And, I'm going to talk a little bit about why a regional approach to offshore wind is really important and why I believe Massachusetts should be leading that effort. And, some of the challenges that we do have ahead. So one of the reasons, and I think the most obvious reason to work regionally for offshore wind is because we share a grid, ISO New England. And there's a lot of obvious synergies there in order to maximize the area of the ocean we have off the seacoast. So we're not competing against one another. We have a greater capacity for purchasing power as a group. And so it really helps us match some of those heavy hitters like New York and New Jersey. And so there's a lot of obvious reasons to work together. Some of the reasons I was worried about this approach at the onset is because, as we've seen in other areas, sometimes Massachusetts wants to get further out front, and working with other states sometimes holds us back. And yet we're not seeing that with this approach. We're seeing real interest from our New England neighbors who all agree that this is an important issue moving forward. And in fact, I would say Massachusetts is kind of middle of the pack, and we are losing ground as leaders in renewable energy and taking these issues seriously. I want to thank our legislators who are here for voting for the Next Generation Climate Bill, not only once, but twice in very short time. I hope you will all join me in putting pressure on the governor to sign that legislation. And honestly, there's even more we can be doing, but that is a wonderful first step toward this road of bringing on more procurement, more, let's say, energy, green energy, toward dealing with our environment. So, I think that is probably our biggest hurdle right now, is really getting over, getting the governor to sign this thing. And even if he doesn't, I know the legislature is poised to be able to override it, but we need the governor to be a partner in this effort. And so I encourage all of you to weigh in with his office. The New England for Offshore Wind Massachusetts chapter sent an open letter to the governor, not only asking him to sign this bill, but really refuting his reasoning behind the veto and correcting the record. And so there are a few people on this call who are also part of our Massachusetts committee. Kai Salem is here, Cindy Lupi is here, and there may be others that I missed, but we're really working as a team to get this through. So maybe I'll take a break here and let Amber jump in. I don't want to take over the show here, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And thank you all too, I just have to say, for your support of carbon pricing. When I first wrote and filed that legislation, I felt very alone. And in fact, I was
Looks like Jen's audio froze up there for a second.
Yeah.
Amber, do you want to just go ahead and jump in for now?
I'll jump in. She's fortunate. She's frozen on a lovely smile, which doesn't always go that way. So, hi everyone. I hope I'm not talking over Jen. I hope she catches this, but thanks. I don't know if you can hear me. Thanks, Jen. Oh, she looks like she's gone. Thanks everyone for being here, and thank you to the SAFE team for pulling this together. I think the message I just want to set us up with here today is that we are a long way in. Oh, Jen just texted me that she got kicked off, so hopefully she'll make her way back in. We're a long way into the offshore wind journey, and we have a very long way to go. So at wherever you are joining this from, whatever stage of offshore wind, it's just wonderful to see such an enormous group here tonight. And I know there's a whole range of engagement. Some of you have been working on offshore wind advocacy for years, and some of you may be showing up curious about this for the first time. So I want to first just offer, I will put my contact information in the chat, but I'm always very happy to talk about just the journey that brought us here, the details of this moment, and where we need to go from here. And it's a really wonderful time to be gathering with all of you, because we are at a little bit of a turning point in Massachusetts, because offshore wind, and across the region, but because offshore wind, all development that we're talking about has to take place in federal waters. So everything is hinged to action at the federal level as well. We have a lot of advocacy we need to do in the states, but we can't get a single project built without cooperation from the federal government. So of course, it's a whole new day, and we've been in quite a bit of stagnation for 4 years now. And we're looking to just unleash all of the progress that has been held up. So all that to say, we are looking out at the outlook in Massachusetts, as Jen mentioned, and hoping that we can raise the bar here in the Commonwealth in the very near term, because Massachusetts was an early leader on offshore wind. Today is actually my 8-year anniversary of working on offshore wind power with the National Wildlife Federation. And I've been in Massachusetts for most of that time. I'm from Massachusetts, and I'm actually on the North Shore in Newburyport. So while most of my advocacy has been happening south of here, I am thrilled to be gathering with those of you looking to see where the North Shore can fit into the nation's offshore wind story. Massachusetts was one of the first states to enact an offshore wind policy and initiate a national conversation about what this resource could be here. We are, of course, though, now a full 30 years behind European offshore wind development. The first offshore wind project was built in Denmark in 1991, and there are now nearly 6,000 offshore wind turbines operating around the world, generating clean power, revitalizing communities, and we're missing out. And Massachusetts saw an opportunity years and years ago now, and initiated this process. And as Jen mentioned, though, we have recently been truly eclipsed by our neighbors to the south. Massachusetts set an initial goal of 1,600 megawatts, and recently in 2018 then doubled it. So we have on the books a 3,200 megawatt commitment to offshore wind power, but by comparison, New Jersey has a 7,500 megawatt commitment. New York has a 9,000 megawatt commitment. And why that matters is just that those signals tell industry where they should invest and where there's the most promising pipeline for development, and Massachusetts is falling behind in sending that signal. And frankly, we can only keep up so much on our own. And this is where New England collaboration really comes into play, that if we work regionally, we can compete with numbers like that and ensure that benefits, economic benefits, come to our part of the coastline. So in terms of legislative action, Jen mentioned the climate bill, and that is the absolute central top priority at this moment. We've got to get that bill signed, and ultimately the commitment in that bill will bring Massachusetts' goal up to a total of 5,600 megawatts. So that's closer, not quite on par yet with New York and New Jersey, but it's getting up to a place where we can really stand proud and say that we have a commitment that matches the scale of this opportunity, because that's really, it's why so many of us are here. It's why the National Wildlife Federation launched an offshore wind campaign, because we are facing this overwhelming climate crisis, and we need to invest in solutions that can rise to the scale of the challenge. And we are not alone at National Wildlife Federation in having recognized this many years ago, that offshore wind is uniquely positioned in the Northeast region to rise to that challenge. It is right where we need it. It is close to our energy demand centers. It's strong, it's consistent, and the technology is advanced. So we have this unique opportunity to launch a new industry with advanced technology. And so the stars have been aligned for a long time. Now, while we did initiate early offshore wind goals, sign them into law, start implementing those goals. So there are now 2 offshore wind projects in the queue for Massachusetts, 2 projects with offshore wind contracts, each of 800 megawatts, and moving through the federal permitting process. We've got to keep getting more in the queue, because these projects take so long to move from the time when that contract is issued to when they are actually generating power. Several year lead time, and it's important. There's an important amount of stakeholder engagement and real scrutiny that needs to be applied to these projects. We're talking about massive development in a vulnerable ecosystem. We've got to make sure that we're doing this right. So that just brings me to sort of my next point about our hopes and dreams for the offshore wind future in this region, that this isn't just about building big projects as fast as we can, but that we see this as a real opportunity to solve multiple problems at once. We have an economic crisis upon us. We have a racial justice crisis upon us, and we need to really consider how we can, when we're investing in something so transformational in scale, that we take that with immense responsibility to do it right. So everything that we are advocating for with the Massachusetts Offshore Wind Committee within this New England regional coalition, it's not just as much offshore wind as we can, as fast as we can, but it's moving quickly in a responsible way to ensure that we're creating high quality jobs in this region, to ensure that we are encouraging minority economic participation and ensuring that wildlife are protected every step of the way. And what I want you all to hear in that is that we are confident that we are capable. So we can do all of these things quickly, and we can do them right. We can't continue to worsen other problems with solutions, and we don't have to. We can truly see the opportunity. I know I often say I can't take credit for this, but I don't know its origin, but that with climate change, you can either be overwhelmed by the by the problem or you can be inspired by the solution. And offshore wind has been my beacon of hope now for almost a decade as something that can be a solution to so many of our intersecting challenges right now. I mentioned a bit about just the eclipsing of New York and New Jersey, but it's not just New York and New Jersey that we're competing with or potentially collaborating with. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, Virginia, states are passing comprehensive offshore wind policies and seeing the potential in this moment. There was recently a bill introduced in New Hampshire as well for a 600 megawatt minimum offshore wind procurement. Maine is getting to work on exploring this opportunity. So we are, when I first started working on offshore wind, it was like the side issue, it was the side idea. It was sort of a little boutique concept of maybe someday, but this has really made its way into every large scale clean energy conversation and something that is going to be instrumental to reaching our clean energy goals as a state, as a region, as a nation. And now we have a federal government that really sees the potential in this opportunity. So I know many of you followed Climate Day with the Biden administration last week, but part of the executive order that came out during Climate Day is a commitment to offshore wind power. The line within the executive order was a doubling of offshore wind power, which I don't know if it's exactly the right wording because we don't really have any. We only have 7 turbines in the entire United States, but it sounds like it was more of a doubling down sentiment. There is an immense commitment to offshore wind from this administration. And just days ago, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the entity responsible for offshore wind leasing and permitting, their new director was just announced, a woman named Amanda Lefton, who comes from the Cuomo administration in New York and from the Nature Conservancy, and she is deeply committed to and invested in the large-scale development of an offshore wind industry. So we're in good hands once again. And the moment she arrived in the office, her first, what seemed like her first duty was to reinitiate the Vineyard Wind permitting process. So relevant to Massachusetts, the first large scale offshore wind project likely to come online, the most mature in the permitting process, is Vineyard Wind. It's Massachusetts' 800 megawatt offshore wind project. And it has been moving through all of its permitting processes for multiple years now, and was supposed to complete that process in December, but they ultimately paused their application and shifted the timeline so that the decision would fall under this administration. So that process is back underway, and we will likely see a decision from the administration within the next couple of months. So they just announced yesterday that they are picking that process right up where it left off. So it looks like our Massachusetts project remains first in line for hopefully approval, but for advancing throughout this federal permitting process. I'm looking to wrap up because I would love to get to questions now. I will just say one more thing in case there's more interest in this. I didn't talk much about the Gulf of Maine and the prospect for more lease areas. So right now, all wind energy areas designated and leased in this region are south of the Cape, but there is already a process underway, a tri-state process. Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire are all engaged in a federal task force that is focused on starting to move toward drawing lines on a map in the Gulf of Maine and designating those areas for wind energy development. So that's of course highly relevant to us here on the North Shore, and honestly, that process takes multiple years. So I don't want anyone to hear to feel concerned or fearful about that. We are at the very beginning of the process. That task force has met one time. So there are meetings. It's expected that group will start meeting again in the first half of this year. I think it's another thing we can expect to be to gain some momentum now that this administration is here. And there will be plenty of opportunity to weigh in on where those areas should be, what they should look like, what they should consider. There's a pretty extensive stakeholder engagement process that comes with that. So something to look forward to. I'll leave it there. I would love to hear if there are any questions or topics I touched on that folks would like to hear more detail about.
I'm just going to ask a quick question, Amber, and then we definitely have a couple of questions in the chat. For that BOEM meeting that will hopefully restart soon for the more northern states, right? So Maine, New Hampshire, and northern Massachusetts. As I recall, and just correct me if I'm right or wrong here, local officials should have perhaps received already an invite to participate in that, and if not, we can get them an invite to do so. Is that
the next meeting of that Gulf of Maine task force?
Yeah.
Yep. So that meeting hasn't been scheduled yet, right. But when it is, it's a public meeting, so anyone can. It's usually a full day. Anyone can tune in, and there are public comment opportunities and question opportunities actually throughout the course of the meeting.
Great. And then, so one of our first questions here from Jeff Cohen is if you could address how the use of footprint site in Salem can be a great location for wind facilitation. I could go ahead and share some of those slides if you want to talk us through that to answer that question.
I think, yes, if you have slides, that would be wonderful. I'm sure there are folks on the line who even know more about this than I do. So I'll just dabble, but I do think, I've watched the recent presentations that have taken place in Salem, and it sounds like, so Mass CEC did their port assessment, including the site, and what I've heard and read has been incredibly promising, that there is great potential to utilize this site. I mean, there is so much, there are so many components to building an offshore wind project, and there's so much opportunity for ports to play a part. And it appears that this site is incredibly viable for various options. So I would say everyone should feel excited about the opportunity, and I certainly be looking forward to advocacy efforts in collaboration with local experts.
So I believe that's sharing. Is that working?
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so just so everybody knows, this is where you can go ahead and see all of the detail of this presentation, but some selective slides that we just chose to kind of pull out from there. If I can get this to move forward. There we go. So Amber, is it okay to have you talk to a couple of these things? I don't know where.
Well, so what we're looking at here is, so these are every sort of colored block there along the Atlantic coast are wind energy areas that have been leased by the federal government. So that started in 2013, and the last auction was in 2019. So this all has happened very recently. These areas one by one have been held for competitive auction for offshore wind developers to lease the rights to build in these areas. So that's what sort of all of those names listed in the middle of the screen. Those are the names of developers and project names for each of these areas. So of course, they're all pretty far south. I will say it feels more like the Salem opportunity is hinged to future development off of this map. In the Gulf of Maine prospect that we've been talking about. But that's not necessarily true if we're talking about manufacturing opportunities and supply chain opportunities. So those are just chances at this moment to consider how to serve this industry further south, even if it's not receiving a power cable. So this, I guess, is a good snapshot, though, just of the real abundance of development and need. These are all very early in the process. So if there's a name here, it's either because a developer simply holds a lease to that area and therefore can start trying to find a buyer for their power, or they do have a contract with the state and have likely, in that case, submitted their federal permitting application to the federal government, but are multiple years from really getting to a point of construction. So this is really the menu of why we should see great opportunity. We need multiple, probably close to 10 or so ports to serve this kind of industry, just those on the top half. So I think this is a good snapshot of just how abundant the need is.
And then this is looking a little bit more towards Gulf of Maine.
Yes. Yeah. So I didn't mention that, actually. So there is a floating research. So the Gulf of Maine, of course, it is different from, and the reason that most progress has happened south of the Cape has been that most of the Atlantic coast has a gradually sloping wide outer continental shelf that allows for current technology of offshore wind to be developed easily. It's fixed foundation piles driven into the seafloor. And that's really the state of the industry to date. But in recent years, developers have been advancing floating offshore wind technology, which will open up places like the Gulf of Maine that get really deep really fast, similar challenge to what the situation is on the West Coast. And so the governor of Maine, she recently announced a commitment to building a floating, actually larger than what's mentioned on the screen here, a 12 turbine, I believe, floating research project. So there is some advancement in the Gulf of Maine, but again, we are at the very beginning of a very long leasing project for anything of anything of utility scale.
And then this is looking a little bit more locally at the different opportunities at our local ports.
Okay, great. Yes.
And I think I'll just talk to this real quick. I think, the thing that you can see here, and this is a draft from the presentation that was made, is that in looking at some of these ports north of Boston, Salem and Beverly have many different opportunities to be considered, both from operation and maintenance possibilities for servicing the turbines, to manufacturing possibilities, to actual marshaling possibilities, which maybe Amber, you could speak to a little bit what marshaling means, if you know.
I can't. I don't know if anyone else wants to.
So I think that's really kind of putting everything together and shipping it out.
Sounds right.
And one of the big things with the Salem port is that we don't have any overhead obstructions. So we have a deep water port with no overhead obstructions, and that's fairly rare in our area. So as we understand it, that's one of the real pluses to our port. But just, so that everybody knows that they are looking at kind of how all of these different ports might fit into the picture. And then I think this is the last one, just kind of showing that, Salem may serve multiple purposes, but it isn't only, there could be activity that goes from Portsmouth, where there may be some more fabrication and things may actually get brought, this is just conceptually, right? Things could get brought to Salem, put together, and then launched out to both the South Shore, or if there were ever development north, it could perhaps go north as well. So.
For people who are more less technically trained, as I am, less technically trained than Cindy and Amber, I just wanted to say that those visuals that Cindy has up on the screen right now, the top visual of the yellow floating is the floating mechanism. That is the base of the floating turbine. And as the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center told us, that base could easily could be constructed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and then what they would do is tow it down to Salem, where the perhaps the rest of the turbine, I don't know the exact technical terms, but with the rest of the turbine would be installed on that base, and then as the photo there shows, it would be towed out to its place in sea. So that's when Cindy mentioned that we have no bridges here over Salem Harbor. We have no power lines crossing Salem Harbor. That makes Salem Harbor perfect as a place to tow those turbines out from. That's not the case with many of the ports. Amber, do you want to talk about what some of the challenges were for the New Bedford port?
Well, and just to sort of give a little background on the New Bedford port, the Massachusetts did have some foresight when it comes to port infrastructure and investment, and the Patrick administration actually, so we're going back a little ways, did make an initial decision to invest in what is now called the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. It's the only port facility in the country that's purpose built for the deployment of offshore wind infrastructure. So that is a great, well, it was built if you're going back to those times, you may recall it was built for with Cape Wind in mind, but this was actually an excellent investment even without that project going forward, because it's now likely to be used for offshore wind projects. For many offshore wind projects, as it's the only place that can do that, or that's intended to do that of some scale right now. That said, with the immense lineup of offshore wind projects that were listed on the screen a few slides back, there needs to be far more than that. So the stars really align for places like Salem with the advantages that Cindy and Pat just mentioned to make early steps to just really get on the map here as a resource.
Great, thank you. So, so I'm just going back to the questions here.
Oh, there's a great bunch of
one question that's in the chat from Esmeralda Bissono, who is our City of Salem Sustainability Coordinator. Esmeralda asks if you've seen any climate action plans from municipalities that have showed that they are counting on offshore wind. It's ironically both Salem and Beverly mentioned, and both in the proposal as good places for offshore wind development. We are in the midst with Esmeralda doing a lot of doing the coordinating of a resilient plan for Beverly and Salem. Do you know if any municipalities are really counting on offshore wind as part of what we would like to use as to stave off some of the worst effects of climate change?
I can't speak to any examples that come to mind specifically. I will say that the reason that our focus has been at the state and regional level is just the massive scale of development. So while municipalities can certainly have we've done sort of like sign-on letters and things with mayors and city councils and things like that in the past. It's really, the action needs to happen at the state level because of the scale of purchase. And so we do, hopefully there will be progress in that regard where we don't just where we aren't limited in that way, and maybe a municipality could like tack on, or a private entity could tack on to a contracted offshore wind project another portion of megawatts to buy into that the scale. But with projects close to a gigawatt a piece and powering 500,000 homes, that needing to be sort of the scale to qualified development. It's a bit of a challenge at a smaller scale, but yeah.
So we have a couple of questions regarding kind of transmission and grid. So one of the questions we have here is, could offshore wind use the same transmission apparatus? It says it's gas, but I'm assuming that's probably as our gas power plant once the energy is brought to the mainland. So would transmission lines need to be changed, or is it once you land it, is it similar?
Great question. So it's similar. It can plug into the existing grid. There will need to be transmission infrastructure to a degree offshore to connect these offshore wind turbines to the mainland grid. There will be the cables underground from the project to the land-based transmission system. So technically speaking, yes, it can plug into the existing grid. There will be a need, not immediately with these first projects, but in the very near term, a need for pretty immense transmission upgrades, just given the scale of power that we're talking about delivering into the grid. That's not necessarily an offshore wind specific answer, though. I mean, we need these transmission grids just for the scale of electrification that's needed as well throughout the transition that needs to take place over the next decade. So yes, it can, there's not necessarily an inherent need to change or improve our transmission system in order to accommodate offshore wind, but at the scale we're talking about, there is.
Okay. And then the next question we have that's similar related is, can you discuss the issue of purchasing power for the New England grid and how we can think more about that?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So I guess it might be a question just sort of about state versus regional procurement and whether we can procure at a regional scale, New England wide. I don't know who asked the question, so I don't know if anyone wants to. I don't want to answer that.
Jack Crivet, and if I can find him to unmute him, I'll ask him to explain a little more.
Oh, I see him in the chat.
Okay, good.
I see a couple of comments here about regional development being the way to go. And yeah, we agree. We absolutely need regional collaboration in whatever form that can take. So there has been already a bit of regional collaboration in the sense that Massachusetts put out a call for proposals, and then Rhode Island and Connecticut actually sort of chose from those proposals after Massachusetts had made its selection. And that's not ideal. It wasn't a very transparent process, but it still marked that there is some behind the scenes collaboration happening. That said, we would certainly, and frankly, Governor Baker has said recently that he's inclined toward regional procurement and regional collaboration. And we just want to be really clear that we don't think anything should be slowed down or held up before that mechanism or exactly how that will play out is designed. We think we still need the urgency of this moment, the urgency of our climate challenges, of our energy existing retirements. We've got to keep moving. We've got to keep Massachusetts and the region at the forefront. But certainly when we're talking about building this out to the scale that it could really serve the region, the more collaboration and cooperation, the better. I mean, there's serious potential for some just sort of backlog of supply chain needs and everything. So there's so much room for this to be better coordinated across the New England states.
One of the questions we have from Robert Myers is, are we intending to participate in the build out of the Jones Act service fleet and will be setting standards for development of clean energy power for that fleet and beyond? I don't know if you know about that a little bit or not. It's not something I'm familiar with particularly.
Well, I mean, so the Jones Act does apply to offshore wind. And so there's a huge amount of employment and workforce development opportunity that comes with that. We've got to develop vessels that can serve this industry. So in terms of if that's, I mean, it's something that we would like to see happening quickly. We support the undertaking there, and we of course work as closely as possible with partners in labor and support the opportunities inherent with the Jones Act provisions and protection. So I think the answer is yes. I again wish I could hear from the questioners to make sure I'm answering the right question, but
yeah, I'm not sure if Dave's on the line, if he can try to unmute a few of these folks for that. Dustin Luca asks, based on the exhaustive, the time and exhaustive process of permitting to put turbines out in federal waters, kind of what does the process of building a marshaling facility in Salem, be it footprint or Shetland or elsewhere, look like in comparison to that kind of timeline and scale, I would imagine. And then on that note, he also asks if is footprint the entire focus, or could Shetland be a factor here as new ownership there considers the property's future? So Shetland is a little bit farther in where Pickering Wharf is, if you're familiar with that, Amber.
Yep. So I think in terms of the timing, while there is a long lead time, offshore wind projects take many years to come to fruition. Because of how far we are into the process, I think there's really nothing to wait for right now. Like, the offshore wind industry is taking off. It is, we are far along that we could see projects coming into operation within the next couple of years, by 2023, certainly. So I think any site or community interested in bringing a site into the mix should move now. I think that there's already immense port investment happening south of us. New York and New Jersey, their governors are incredibly enthusiastic about offshore wind and continue to announce massive port investments. And so we aren't seeing that to the same scale in Massachusetts. And I really see that as an advocacy opportunity for communities that would like to be home to it. And footprint does not need to be the only focus by any stretch. There is no shortage of need to serve this industry. And there's nothing to wait for.
How long did it take them to build out the Bedford facility?
That's a great question. It was years, but not many. I would say maybe 3, somewhere in that ballpark, probably a maximum of 3. But it was a $113 million project ultimately. So it created a lot of jobs and continues to. It's working. So it took a while, but that was a project built with purpose and intention. So it was quick as in terms of the scale of something like that.
Joel Kirshner asks, to what extent are money outlays required from the state or federal governments to get offshore wind done? Which, yeah. Yeah,
very little. I mean, so it depends. These are private companies building these projects, and the sort of few checkpoints of where there's public money headed into this effort, it is first at the federal level, there are tax credits available to the industry. So both a production and an investment tax credit that do serve to incentivize investment and incentivize build out of essentially, because we are at the early stage of offshore wind, we are actually not yet capable in the United States of building an offshore wind project. These are massive. They're significantly larger than the largest land-based projects. And so we don't have manufacturing facilities that can be put to work on offshore wind. We need to make that infrastructure investment, and there needs to be manufacturing facility investment. So there's just a premium that comes with these first projects that those tax credits serve to bring down a bit. So there's a federal tax credit, and then at the state level, it really comes in the form of those of any investments in ports and infrastructure and research. But ultimately, this is it's a private endeavor and the price tag has been really encouraging. So I think that's a fairly important message to take away this evening, especially in Massachusetts. We have a long history of a narrative that offshore wind is too expensive. And I think when something doesn't come to fruition, it's easy to assume that it's because it's too expensive and that it never won in the market. But that's really not the case for offshore wind anymore. Because this technology has been advancing for 30 years, the cost has been declining for all of that time. And so the Vineyard Wind project, for example, as I mentioned, the furthest along nationwide in the permitting process, came in at an incredibly competitive price, and it's actually over the lifetime of its contract going to save Massachusetts ratepayers $1.4 billion. So this is economically a wise investment, not just from a ratepayer protection perspective. It's something that we are really comfortable supporting and endorsing. It will actually, we don't even have to say like it won't have much of an impact on your energy bills. It will actually be a benefit.
I want to be mindful of time. We're near 7:30 and we've got some great questions. So what I'm going to do is ask 2 more questions. Well, actually, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an opportunity for both Joan Lovely and Bob Blair to share a little bit more about what they know of the Salem Harbor situation, because they've been adding a lot of great information along in the chat, but I want to give them a chance to talk. Okay. Then we'll go to the final slides, and then anybody who wants to stay, if Amber's willing to stay on for a little bit, we'll try to answer a few more questions. Okay.
I will stay as long as there are questions.
Bob, I know you had mentioned some things. I know you have a close relationship with the port, so I wanted to give you an opportunity.
Great. Well, thanks. This is a great meeting. And, you know, there's a lot of really interesting questions that I've seen raised. So obviously people are thinking about this. It turns out, and I think the CEC report really backs this up now, that the Port of Salem stands to be one of the most important ports for wind energy use, not only during construction, but possibly in the manufacturing end. In the Commonwealth and in the region, and the opportunity to work in conjunction with other ports like Portsmouth, as was shown in the slide, is really great. And all the ports really in the area are probably going to see an uptick in business demand for port facilities. So I think that really the good news is there's a lot of business coming, and particularly if it comes around the corner into the Gulf of Maine. There was one slide that showed that 150 nautical mile ring that reached down to the south. And that was really there to show that the Port of Salem is within reach for a lot of those projects that are coming up. And so I think we're going to see real interest beginning to materialize in the next year about how to best put the Port of Salem back to work in support of that. And really what the advantages of it that have been mentioned are obviously the clear overhead, the deep water access, the over 40 acres of flat ground that are sitting there ready to go. You know, the coal pile is gone, the oil tanks are gone. It's gravel parking lot, and you have a deep water dock that will need some upgrade. But in terms of a ready to go facility, the footprint site is really a front runner in the eyes of CEC for the Commonwealth. And I think that's going to become more dominant as this all evolves. So I think it's very exciting, and I think it's awesome, this meeting, and obviously the great list of questions. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm happy to participate. We're working hard on this all the time, and we're trying to bring as much power as possible to the table to get this done, because it is what's best for the whole region and all the ports.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Joan, I'd like to give you an opportunity if you'd like to say something as well.
Thank you, Cindy, and I want to say thank you to SAFE for hosting this forum tonight. Thank you to Amber, nice to see you, and to Jen. Great to see you too, Jen. It's been too long. Yeah, I've been putting some things in the chat. Been attending the Port Authority meetings for a couple of years now, following this issue, knowing that the footprint, that 40 acres is sitting there, waiting to be redeveloped, and now what is going to go there. So actually, the Salem Harbor plan, I think, or it might be the Port Authority, has put out a survey. So make sure that people go in and take that survey and put down what you think that should go on those 40 acres. That's a community involved process, and they would like to hear from the community. So, but as far as the future of wind, we don't have many designated port areas in Massachusetts. 10. Beverly gave up theirs just a couple of years ago to go in another direction. And these are the types of industries that we want to attract, enormous economic development. As the mayor said just in the Port Authority meeting at 5 o'clock, Bob was there as well. We've always had our back to the water in Salem. Now it's to make it our front yard. And here's a great opportunity to really develop our port and make it really a working port and something that brings a tremendous amount of economic development to our region. So thank you again, SAFE. Thanks, Pat. Thank you, Cindy.
Thanks, Joan. I'm going to go ahead and just share the final slide here, which I think is sharing now. And then, like I said, we'll go back to some further questions, but just to be mindful of everyone's time. So for folks that are interested in wind and the next steps, we'd encourage you to check out the New England for offshorewind.org website. There's a bunch of upcoming webinars in the next week. You can tell that there's a lot of activity and a lot of interest right now. One on offshore wind and a just transition, one about harnessing wind off the Massachusetts South Coast. Mayflower Wind is also going to be holding a virtual town hall. One of the big next steps that we certainly heard today, and I'm going to ask that maybe if Cindy Loopy or one of those folks is on still, if they could put in the chat the best way to encourage the governor to sign that climate bill so that we can get some additional goals for offshore wind into the system. And then from SAFE's perspective, if you're interested in joining our renewable energy working group, you can go ahead and email salemsafe@gmail.com and let us know. Some of the things that we're working on there have been a wind resolution that we'd like to bring to Salem City Council, but then also to other local municipalities. And if you're interested, it doesn't have to be Salem only. We just heard how much, this is going to be a regional approach. So while we're, have a little bit of focus here on Salem, we're interested in anybody who's interested in this regionally. As well as doing some wind education and outreach so that we can continue to improve the knowledge base out in our communities, so that as this comes forward, more people understand what it means, can get a chance to ask their questions, so they're not fearful of what it might bring, and we can look at it realistically. And supporting other offshore wind developments as well. The more we see positive development out there, the more we'll learn from and be able to do it more on the Northeast coast as well. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our attendees, and then we'll go back to some question and answers, and I'll stop sharing the screen again.
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore something that Senator Lovely said, which is please go to the salem.com, the city website, and look under Salem Harbor Plan Update. And you'll find that there's a survey there that will ask you what you would like to see at that footprint site. And this is a chance for us to support offshore wind. If offshore wind is not there at that footprint site, then perhaps one of their rumored dreams of hundreds of condos will be on that site. And I think that we're looking at what will help us in a just transition in Salem, an opportunity for taxes, for job training, for more green justice, for supporting renewable energy. I think those are all great reasons to have something other than hundreds of condos on that footprint site. Think about that, voice your opinion. Please go to the salem.com website and look for the Salem Harbor Plan update.
Great, thank you. Paul, I was trying to unmute you, Paul Tucker, so that you could say something as well, but it doesn't seem to be working. Oh,
how's that? You got me?
there we go. Yeah, we can hear you
Hey,
now.
thanks, everybody. This is incredible. And every time that SAFE has done these forums, I think the turnout has been bigger and bigger. This is growing, the interest is growing, the excitement is growing. And, you know, when Jen Benson is the headliner, I always joke that if she came and ran against me in Salem, I think she'd beat me. So I don't want her to make a political comeback. But this is wonderful. And I just want to say hi to Jeff Barsnell, who I saw here somewhere. Hi, Jeff. Jeff is just a tremendous guy, and he was in the trenches with everybody for a long time. So, Pat, thank you to everybody. This is just incredible. This is an opportunity of a lifetime right now. We've got some good things happening. We're going to get that bill done. We're going to make sure that we get it done in the form that we want it. We want the governor to sign it. We stand ready to move very, very quickly. And we've got this opportunity now in Salem. Very exciting time, and I'm happy to be a small part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have one final announcement before I get back to questions that I left out, which is that our next SAFE meeting, our meetings are typically scheduled the first Thursday of every month for anybody who wants to join us next month. And our tentative topic, we're finalizing our speakers now, will be on green buildings. So that will be March 4th at 6:30 p.m., just like this evening. So to get back to a couple of questions, there's a few here that are associated with protection of wildlife, as well as kind of the comparison between floating offshore wind turbines and the ground-mounted offshore wind turbines and how they impact wildlife as well.
Excellent, thank you. I did talk unusually little about wildlife tonight, so I appreciate that question. So National Wildlife Federation, of course, we enter cautiously into the world of advocating for any kind of large-scale development. And part of our decision to launch an offshore wind campaign was that we wanted to see offshore wind develop. We also believe it will develop and want to make sure that it is that it's done responsibly every step of the way. I often say we have no need to solve the climate crisis with solutions that worsen our species extinction and habitat loss crisis. So we believe that this is something that can really rise to multiple challenges in a responsible way. A huge part of that, though, is working directly with state and federal regulators and offshore wind developers to ensure that they are applying best management practices every step of the way. I will say that regulation is not strong enough. We cannot sit back and just trust that our wildlife and habitat will be protected throughout development, but we have all the best players at the table in the wonderful world of wildlife advocacy. Our friends at Conservation Law Foundation and Natural Resources Defense Council and Mass Audubon look at every word that is printed about offshore wind development and engage closely, and we will never advocate for a project to move forward until we feel comfortable with the level of scrutiny that's been applied and the standards it's being held to. And fortunately, we can say that in Massachusetts, that has been the case. Vineyard Wind, as our shining example at the front of the pack, actually signed an agreement with us to voluntarily put additional efforts in place to ensure protection of the endangered North Atlantic right whale, which migrates through all of the wind energy areas designated along the coast. And there are fewer than 500 of them alive in the world today. So it's essential that they're protected, monitored, without exception. And offshore wind developers so far have been really willing to come to the table and talk with us and level up in that space. We are hopeful now with the change in leadership in Washington that we'll be able to get some federal regulations in place because of course, all of this is better if it's just a level playing field and we're not depending on developers agreeing to take protections seriously. we also, states have a lot of power in this regard. So for example, Connecticut recently passed an offshore wind bill, their first offshore wind commitment, and they included stringent wildlife protection in their legislation. So they require that every offshore wind project that puts forward a bid is required to demonstrate that they're adhering to best management practices for wildlife protection informed by the latest science. It's something we're advocating for and hope to see on the books in Massachusetts in the near term. So we kind of have multiple tiers of opportunity to advocate for wildlife protection. And you can be certain that anytime that the National Wildlife Federation is showing up in support of a project or a step in the process, that it's because we've looked closely at all of the details and we feel comfortable. We have opposed and actually litigated against offshore wind in the past. So our endorsement is hard to come by, and we're fortunate to say that developers are keeping up with that in the and states in a lot of cases. In the comparison of floating versus fixed foundation, fixed foundation is it's the challenge we know, and floating is the challenge we don't. So with fixed foundations, yes, there's a loud hammering into the sea floor that happens and is incredibly disruptive to wildlife and could be potentially dangerous if done at the wrong times or without the wrong monitoring or without the right monitoring in place. So it has the potential to be dangerous. And we also know how to, what regulations to put in place to do it responsibly. With floating, turbines are anchored to the sea floor with essentially cables in the water column or anchor lines in the water column, very taut, but still something there that is not necessarily a collision or an entanglement risk, but could gather stray fishing gear, for example, and then have a sort of secondary entanglement risk. So there are different concerns with both. We believe they're all manageable.
And can I actually add one thing onto this? I think Amber really touched on, it's really important how states do have a lot of power. One of the reasons why we're working as a coalition is to set sort of standards together as a region. And so if you're a developer coming in to look at Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, we're all sharing the same standards for labor, for wildlife protection. And so I think that really helps us make sure that we're not lowering the standards by competing against one another. And that's one of the things that I really am concerned about. And so when we wrote our coalition agreement, we wrote it with these standards built in for, protecting the labor community. We had members of the labor community at the table, protecting wildlife, and also being cognizant of and working with the fishing industry and other traditional industries that would be impacted.
Well, while we still have some people on the call, I want to point out that Rob Bonney actually put in the chat where you can go for the survey about Salem Harbor and to say what you want to say about the footprint site. And it's just harborplan.salem.com. So harborplan, one word, .salem.com. And we hope you'll voice your opinions about if you are enthusiastic about offshore wind, I hope you'll voice that opinion on the survey.
Great, thanks for pointing that out, Pat. To follow up on the wildlife question, there was also a question regarding how fishermen are being brought in to, weigh in on the siting of these locations or their impacts.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly, just from my experience of crossing paths with members of the fishing industry for all of my 8 years working on offshore wind, and that first and foremost in the designating of an area and the drawing of an area on a map, there's an immense opportunity for public comment and stakeholder engagement, a lot of presence from the fishing industry at that stage. And we started with a wind energy area that was almost twice the size or more than twice the size of what we ended up with. And a lot of that was a result of input from the fishing industry and community. And then from that point forward, at every hearing, at every common opportunity, there is almost always participation from the fishing industry. And in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New York and New Jersey that I know of, but possibly other states, there are fisheries advisory boards or working groups that the state has established. So Massachusetts has a fisheries working group as well as a habitat working group that do inform and have a formal role in informing offshore wind policy implementation and the drafting of requests for proposals. So I think there's, it's, of course, it's the industry that is poised to be impacted by offshore wind development. So it's really important that the voices of the fishing industry are heard every step of the way, and that there are always, every consideration taken to develop this industry in a way that will minimize impacts to existing ocean uses.
Thanks. I asked Jeff Barsnell to unmute as well, so that he's had a bunch of comments in there if he wants to share a few of those or ask some questions. So I think you.
Hey everyone, it makes me so happy to see such a robust conversation, because I remember 12 years ago, Cindy, Pat, and a whole bunch of us talking to people about offshore wind and the fact that we needed to plan for this north of Boston, and everyone looking at us like we were crazy. So, and it's great. It's great to have Amber here, and Jen Benson. Thank you, Representative Benson. You maybe remember me from other areas of the state, but great to see where you landed, and thank you for your advocacy. Amber, I have read recent reports suggesting that we don't just need 5,600 megawatts of offshore wind. We need closer to 22,000 megawatts of offshore wind if we're going to really accomplish our ambitious goals over the next 20 to 30 years, especially with a 2030 goal of 50% reductions and a 2040 goal of now, I think it's a 75 or 70% reductions. That's a whole lot of wind power to build in the next 20 years. How do you think that's going to happen, and where is it going to happen? If I calculate that correctly, we're talking about roughly 44 Cape winds in the next 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, now you're talking in my kinds of numbers. That's absolutely where we need to be looking, where we need to be going, and where we need to be confident we can achieve. Offshore wind, when we're, every region has a different best solution or biggest solution, but for the Northeast region, offshore wind power is not just one of our biggest opportunities, it's our only large scale untapped opportunity. So it's where we have so much low-hanging fruit at the ready, which I think is what we've been talking about tonight. The areas that are ready to go, contracts are rolling. We just need the states to keep up with putting out solicitations, and we'll be able to fulfill these goals. So the kinds of things we're asking for in legislation, 6,000, numbers like that, 6,000 megawatts. That's simply what we consider a floor. So one of our coalition's goals for the year ahead, or the couple years ahead, is to take these ceilings off of offshore wind goals. Most states that have an offshore wind goal in place cap it. Massachusetts is no exception. So we should, there's no reason to have a ceiling on this, because there's an abundance of power offshore when we start thinking about designating new areas, and the fact that technology is keeping up with the need to scale up to that level. Vineyard Wind is going to build their project with turbines that are 13 megawatts apiece. That is, I mean, just in 2016, the Block Island Wind Farm came online with the largest turbines in the world. They were 6 megawatts apiece. So from 2016 to now, the scale of each turbine has more than doubled. So we are, there's only so far that can go, truly, but and maybe we're nearing the maximum that one turbine can generate. But we absolutely, there's enough offshore wind off of the East Coast to, well, I mean, if fully developed, power all of the nation's energy needs twice over. So we're talking about tapping into a fraction of that and still being able to really rise to the scale of the big numbers that we're seeing.
And I think it's a really key point, and then I'll stop after this, that there are very few options if you really want to decarbonize our grid over the next 20, 30 years. There are very few options, especially on a cold February night, where you can have what we enjoy with all the electrons powering the Zoom call and have it be fossil fuel free. And the answer is literally blowing in the wind offshore. So thank you for this. Excellent program. Yay, safe.
Thanks, Jeff. And I want to address another question that you put in the chat, though, regarding the Maine governor's
Oh yeah,
comments, because I want to make sure we don't all leave thinking that Governor Mills doesn't like offshore wind, because she truly does. What recently happened, though, was that she sort of affirmed a moratorium, a 10-year, I believe, moratorium on building offshore wind in state waters. So that's just within 3 miles of shore. It wasn't likely to ever happen anyway, but it's a controversial development area. So it did seem to be, it was included in a letter to the fishing industry. So I think it was addressing concerns that she had heard in that regard. And there was really no loss in terms of development potential still under consideration. We're seeing actually great, Maine was a no-go area for a long time under the LePage administration on the clean energy front. And so now we are in what feels like a new day, and we're seeing she initiated an offshore wind, launched an offshore wind initiative to give attention to considering this opportunity. So I think we're in good hands up there.
And I want to just also mention, because of what Jeff brought up, is the fact that, even if we increase our procurements for an offshore wind to that scale, we don't have the infrastructure to support it. And so, creating a modern grid is really, really important. It's a lot less exciting to talk about, but it's something that we all need to be advocating for as a companion to promoting more renewable energy. And so we couldn't even use that amount of energy produced at this point. And it's a real weakness in our system. And we also need to be developing and investing in storage. So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and we need to be talking about all of it at the same time, because we can get as far out there building as we want, but if we don't have the infrastructure to support it, it's not going to do us any good.
Absolutely. I asked Eileen Matthew to unmute, so because she had several questions as well, so I'll let her go.
I just had a question for Amber. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. So I'm a sailor and love birds, and I know you're concerned about those things, but can you just address, I know there are some pretty major migrations that happen and land on, like Marblehead Neck and Nahant and Monhegan and so forth. And so I guess we're not talking right now about probably about maybe other than Monhegan, but that's probably only 6 miles offshore. So we're probably not talking about those flyways per se, but what has there been pretty good study on, for instance, the Vineyard Wind and the flyway south of the Cape?
So this is something we work very closely with Mass Audubon on, and they've been engaged with every step of the way. There are concerns. I don't want to minimize the fact that there's a risk, a potential for risk here. There's a lot of ways to mitigate that risk. So primarily that comes in the siting decision, the decision of where to put these turbines. And so Mass Audubon was integral in drawing the initial lines on a map for the wind energy areas at play now. And that's not to say that they come without any impact, but we were able to circumvent some impact early on in the process by avoiding critical migratory pathways. And then there's also just constantly advancing technology with lighting and visibility. And we are, the challenge with with offshore wind development in the US is that we don't have local data to draw from. So there's very little existing monitoring. I mean, we're finally getting some from the Block Island wind farm to be able to really ground truth our expectations with data of the experience and interaction. And so we are constantly integrating what we learn from the Block Island wind farm into what we ask of developers and regulators to ensure that these that the turbines are in every way mitigating any sort of collision risk with birds. The one project that we have litigated against at National Wildlife Federation was because of an avian concern in New Jersey with the vulnerable red knot, and it was in an area that was important to them. So it's something that we are constantly keeping a close eye on and weighing in on, and always improving. You know, as the information that we gather improves with every project, we'll be able to better improve our asks. I think an important detail with Vineyard Wind is that, you know, we always ask for commitments to pre, during, and post construction monitoring so that we have the data to really back up what we need to be doing to always improve.
Great. And do you think, oh, one last thing, I know that, for instance, Cornell Ornithology Group, they do things like monitor migration by radar, and they'll do things like ask them to turn off the lights in New York City at the ground zero site because the birds get, anyway, so is there any chance that there'll be that kind of integration of data? So if they know that there's a whole bunch of birds migrating through an area, they can, I mean, are you kind of integrating those things?
That's a great question. It's possible. I would like to follow up with you in terms of like whether that conversation is underway because I'm not a part of it, but certainly I could imagine that being at play.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So
Amber, Cindy Lupi has a question in the chat, and it was, could you speak to the potential for offshore wind to help prevent new biomass or gas plants to be sited in low-income communities and communities of color? And to that, I'll just add that that was Cindy's question, but we know that there are all kinds of reasons why the new gas-fired power plant got sited in Salem rather than on Marblehead Neck or out in Nahant, that it's very often in low-income communities and communities of color. So how can offshore wind be a catalyst for more climate justice?
I love this question. Thanks, Cindy. So there's immense potential here, and it's a place we, in terms of our advocacy message, can improve quite a bit. I think it's really important to always underscore that offshore wind isn't just about what we're building, but it's about what we're replacing and what doesn't need to be built because offshore wind was built. So we're talking about the scale of development. Every offshore wind project to be built is the scale at which you would replace a power plant or not need to build one. So critical to being able to say no to something is to be right there saying, and this is what we should say yes to. So while offshore wind still needs to be done right, still needs to be done in a way that is responsible to communities, and I don't want to minimize the fact that all kinds of infrastructure development could have a negative impact if not done right. It does absolutely present an enormous opportunity in communities where projects that would have a detrimental environmental justice or public health impact to be able to say, this is why we really don't need to do that. And that is also why we need to just continue to increase the scale at which we bring offshore wind opportunity into the mix, at which we set higher goals as states and designate areas offshore, because we need to be ready as plants, as existing traditional fuel plants are slated for retirement, and as we can demand for more retirements, that we are ready to say this is good to go. And as Jen mentioned, of course, all of the grid upgrades that need to come with that, we need to be ready for this because the need is constantly arising.
Great. I'm just going to highlight a couple of comments that were in the chat, not so much questions, but comments. Robert Myers wrote that new research regarding painting one blade on the turbines black is looks like it's reducing bird kill rates by 70% or more. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with or not.
I've never heard that, and I'm going to look it up
Look it
tonight.
up now. And then Bob Blair also mentioned the conversion of electrons to hydrogen at sea, producing liquid hydrogens may resolve a lot of the grid issues, and that's being researched as well. And then I think that covers most of the questions. There's probably something that I'm missing. But I think that covers most of the questions that were out there. So if we missed a question, we'll try to make sure that we get back to you. But I think that we've covered most of the questions. I really appreciate all of the time that everybody's put into attending the meeting tonight, and it was wonderful to see so many people on board. And I really appreciate the time that Amber and Jen have given us this evening as well, and all of our politicians that have participated. So it's a really wonderful conversation, and hopefully we'll continue to keep it going. Oh, there was one more question. It was whether we know if GE Lynn is something that could help support the wind industry, or at least an ally, since GE certainly makes wind turbines, and if that's another leverage point that we should be considering. And if we know.
I don't know. I look to anyone on the screen who may know.
So that's certainly something else in our region that we should be considering. So, so thank you for that. And we hope to see you at our next meetings. And if you are interested in continuing the conversation, we'll certainly have more of these in the future, but feel free to email us at salemsafe@gmail.com if you want to be part of the renewable energy / wind working group. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's really wonderful
Thank
to
you.
spend the evening with you.
Thanks all. Have a good evening. Stay safe.